Chapter 2. Darwin's Mistake. Warm Little Pond. Darwin's claim to fame was the discovery of natural selection, widely regarded as the mechanism of evolution. But before taking a closer look at that, we should consider the origin of life itself. How did that happen? In the second, 1860, edition of The Origin of Species, Darwin speculated, probably all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from some one primordial form, into which life was first breathed by the Creator. First breathed by the Creator. The last three words, not present in the first edition of 1859, were perhaps a tactful concession toward the advocates of special creation, who were still dominant in 1860. In the same 1860 edition, Darwin made a similar addition to the end of the book. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one. Here he allowed that life might have been breathed into matter more than once by special actions of the Creator. But no such intellectual evasion was needed 12 years later when he wrote to his close friend and supporter, the botanist Joseph Hooker. But if, and oh what a big if, we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc. present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. Now he was hoping to find that life might have originated in a warm little pond. But in the ensuing 145 years, numerous attempts to generate life in test tubes have been made, and all have failed. The Miller-Urey experiments of 1953 produced mainly a simple amino acid, along with traces of some others, under conditions that did not match the early Earth environment it intended to replicate. No further progress has been made. The origin of life field is a failure. We still do not have even a plausible coherent model, let alone a validated scenario for the emergence of life on Earth, Eugene Koonin said in 2011. A Russian immigrant at the NIH and a senior investigator at the National Center for Biotechnology Information, Koonin also said that a succession of exceedingly unlikely steps is essential for the origin of life, making the final outcome seem almost like a miracle. Koonin also writes, scientists have also been unable to find life on Mars or anywhere else. The question how life began and why it seems to be unique here remains a conspicuous difficulty for the materialistic view of life. Life has this remarkable feature. Organisms can reproduce themselves. Darwin and just about everyone else took their self-reproducing capacity for granted. It does happen, obviously. Bacteria do it asexually. Cells in the body do it. But a big leap of faith was required to accept that the accidental collision of molecules, even given billions of years, could generate self-reproducing entities called cells. Bear in mind that natural selection can play no role at this stage because it assumes the prior existence of self-reproducing entities. We also need to remind ourselves just how improbable such things are. No non-living thing has ever been able to reproduce itself without assistance from an intelligent, human agent. If it could be done, factory assembly lines might well become a thing of the past. As to natural selection, it also seems remarkable that the machinery of evolution should be built automatically into self-reproducing organisms. But that is what many of those with scientific aspirations came to believe after The Origin of Species was published. What do we really know about natural selection? To summarize the current view, as a source of innovation, mutations in the DNA molecule generate random variations, and natural selection then acts as a filtering device. Unfit variants rarely survive even the early stages of development. As a matter of observation then, what we find when organisms reproduce is that descendants incorporate small changes. Offspring differ a little from their parents, and their offspring differ even more from their grandparents, and so on. So the reproduction that we see is imperfect. All die in the end, but some variant forms contrive to leave more offspring than others. Darwin was a materialist, and his theory was as materialistic as his philosophy. So he could not rely on anything beyond or outside the natural world, a designer, for example. In fact, the Origin deliberately set out to explain life in all its complexity without any appeal to a designer or creator. Darwin and his later supporters have assumed that in order to qualify as science, the study of nature must appeal exclusively to natural causes. Science and religion must be kept separate. Miracles are ruled out. Darwin wanted to establish that the study of nature had been updated, with no role allowed for design or the supernatural. Indeed, if his theory was true, no such designer was needed. A letter from Wallace. Darwin was conducting his own leisurely researches, first in London and then at his country house in Kent, when he heard from Alfred Russel Wallace, a naturalist who had spent time in the Malay archipelago. In 1858, he sent a letter to Darwin proposing a theory so similar to Darwin's as to be virtually identical. Wallace's ternnate essay, entitled On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type, spurred the dawdling Darwin into action. His patient note-taking became the origin of species within a year. Coincidentally, both Darwin and Wallace had read Malthus's Essay on the Principle of Population, first published in 1798 and expanded in later editions. A free market economist, Malthus made the argument that population increases geometrically, while food supply grows only arithmetically. The former will rapidly outpace the latter, putting pressure on many organisms and causing many to die of starvation. Darwin found that Malthus, that great philosopher, had given him a theory with which to work. The doctrine of Malthus equally applied to the animal and vegetable kingdoms, where there could be no artificial increase of food and no prudential restraint from marriage, Darwin wrote. Without such restraint, the earth would soon be covered by the progeny of a single pair. Darwin sounded like a modern-day environmentalist in positing that there would one day literally not be standing room. In his autobiography, Darwin said that he first read Malthus in 1838. It at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved, and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species. Wallace said something very similar. Perhaps the most important book he had read, he said, was Malthus's Principle of Population. It eventually gave him the long-sought clue to the effective agent in the evolution of organic species. In short, both Darwin and Wallace read the same book and responded in the same way. Organisms would find themselves pressured by the Malthusian math, somehow causing them to increase in complexity and to speciate, thereby generating the fitter and then the fittest, allowing the fittest of all to survive. "How extremely stupid not to have thought of that," said Thomas Huxley when he first read Darwin's argument. The philosopher Bertrand Russell was a little more careful. Darwin's theory was essentially an extension to the animal and vegetable world of laissez-faire economics. Darwin relentlessly pursued his insight. Organisms live by the Malthusian struggle. Lighten the pressure, mitigate the destruction ever so little, and the number of the species will almost instantaneously increase to any amount. It was as though he thought of new species as waiting in the wings. All organisms had to do was to increase their rate of reproduction, and ever more species would appear on stage. At its heart, Darwin's theory was a theory of competition, with free market insights applied to struggling animals. As to Wallace's indefinite departure from the original type, it is the focal point of what I have called Darwin's mistake. Here is the problem in summary. We all know that small differences are observed between the generations. Offspring may be slightly smaller than the parents, or slightly larger, or different in many other ways. Darwin's mistake was to assume that these differences somehow accumulate over the millennia, so that one species eventually transforms itself into another. Without evidence, Darwin's supporters today still accept that intergenerational differences accumulate, eventually transforming their phenotype or bodily form. But such a transformation has never been observed. No species has ever been seen to evolve into another. What scientists do observe is something quite different: reversion to a mean. Such reversion can be analogized to commuting or going back and forth. But Darwin's theory perceives intergenerational changes as something more resembling an incessant journey. In short, Darwin's mistake was one of extrapolation. Although extrapolation can be a legitimate procedure in scientific analysis, it is always a risky one, and if done without due care, can lead to erroneous conclusions. Wallace's biographer, the science historian Michael Flannery, has pointed out that later in life, Wallace changed his mind and embraced what is now called intelligent design. To me, Flannery said in an interview, the best source on this is the very title to his book, The World of Life, a Manifestation of Creative Power, Directive Mind, and Ultimate Purpose, 1910. In the book, Wallace cited examples of the evidence for design in the natural world. For example, he wrote, "Looking at it as a whole, the bird's wing seems to me to be, of all the mere mechanical organs of any living thing, that which most clearly implies the working out of a preconceived design in a new and apparently most complex and difficult manner, yet so as to produce a marvelously successful result." Today, Wallace's defection from Darwin's camp is usually either played down or widely ignored. 2 questions. Early on, Darwin said that he would offer only general conclusions about the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries, but he would add a few facts in illustration. Publishing all the facts with references was something that he hoped to do in a future work, but that work was never written. The origin was merely his abstract. He rushed to complete it when he saw that Wallace had the same idea and might publish first. The Malthusian forces are usually balanced, Darwin thought, but a trifling event will give the victory to one organic being over another. What checks the tendency of a given species to increase? We don't know, even in a single instance, he allowed. This too he would discuss in his future work and at considerable length, although he never did. In The Origin, Darwin instead addressed 2 great questions. Given that offspring are imperfect copies of the parental generation, can natural selection, on its own, really bring about the transmutation from simple to complex forms, generating new species en route? To that question, Darwin's followers have consistently answered yes. Second, did such organisms form an unbroken parent-offspring chain throughout the history of life? This is the question of universal common descent. It boils down to this: did life emerge from non-life only once? Or could it have happened several or many times? Because time travel is impossible, it is difficult to answer the question, other than by looking at fossils or, more recently, at DNA evidence. Even then, the evidence may not be able to resolve the question decisively. Both questions therefore pose a continuing challenge to Darwin's theory. His own study of domesticated animals provided Darwin with ideas and clues. He joined pigeon fancier clubs in London and marveled at their diversity. The carrier pigeon, the tumbler, the pouter, the trumpeter, the fantail. An ornithologist, if shown these specimens, might well see them as distinct and well-defined species. Meanwhile, we should recall that pigeons, whether specially bred or living in the wild, have never been observed to evolve into anything else. Pigeons they have always remained. Darwin's claim was that, in the natural world, selection accumulated differences, just as human breeders accumulate them under domestication. Animal breeders had indeed shown that some hereditary modification is possible. Breeders knew how to cultivate certain traits, color, length of feather, or wool, for example, and often found that the offspring of selected mates had the desired character more abundantly, or more noticeably than its predecessors. So it could be said a small amount of evolution has occurred between one generation and the next. By analogy, then, Darwin argued that the same process arises in nature, only this time much more effectively. With a rhetorical flourish, he wrote in The Origin, How fleeting are the wishes and efforts of man, how short his time, and consequently how poor will his products be compared with those accumulated by nature during whole geological periods. Can we wonder, then, that nature's productions should be far truer in character than man's productions, that they should be infinitely better adapted to the most complex conditions of life? He was saying that whatever man could do, nature could do better. Just as human breeders selected those individuals best suited to their needs to be the progenitors of the next generation, so, Darwin argued, nature selected those organisms that are best fitted to survive the ongoing struggle for existence. In that way, progressive change would persist. Darwin then claimed that nature's selection was as superior to man's feeble efforts as the works of nature are to those of art. But here he was speaking metaphorically, not appealing to evidence. So there it was. Improving machinery was built into nature, daily and hourly scrutinizing, Darwin wrote, silently and insensibly working at the improvement of each organic being. In this way, Darwin thought, one type of organism would inevitably be transformed into another. He went so far as to write in the first edition of The Origin that he could see no difficulty in bears becoming more and more aquatic in their structure and habits, with larger and larger mouths, till a creature was produced as monstrous as a whale. He abandoned his bears to whales speculation in later editions. If feeble man can do much by his powers of artificial selection, he said, he could see no limit to the beauty and infinite complexity of the co-adaptations between all organic beings. But he failed to point out that feeble man is able to select because he has a rational mind, whereas it has yet to be shown that nature has any such thing. Nature as agent. In Darwin's hands, natural selection resembled a magic wand. It was capable of doing whatever a creator could do. But his theory also introduced something else. The underlying mechanism was no longer supernatural. It had been turned into a naturalistic and scientific claim. It was pleasing to the 19th century for that reason, as it still is to the modern age more generally. Paul Nelson, a philosopher of science with Discovery Institute, points out that when Darwin made his arguments, he saw no need for proof. He said, in effect, "Tell me why these minor changes should not add up over time to major differences." Of course, asking why a particular thing should not happen evades the duty of a hypothesis to explain how it does happen. It was one of Darwin's favorite rhetorical devices, and he used it repeatedly in The Origin. For quite some time, Darwin's mechanism was not seriously examined. Then the renowned geneticist Thomas H. Morgan, winner of the Nobel Prize for his work in mapping the chromosomes of fruit flies, suggested that the whole thing looked suspiciously like a tautology. For it may appear little more than a truism, he wrote, to state that the individuals that are the best adapted to survive have a better chance of surviving than those not so well adapted to survive. Darwin often wrote as if nature were imbued with purpose. Just as breeders could magnify the differences between their varieties by careful selection of breeding stock, so nature itself selected varieties in the wild, eventually generating the species that we see. But can nature make choices in the same way that a farmer can when he is deciding which variants to select? That it could was one of the main arguments in The Origin. In response to Darwin, the philosopher Jerry Footer, the author of What Darwin Got Wrong, with Massimo Piatelli Palmarini, 2010, said that natural selection can't make decisions. Footer also wrote that natural selection can't run experiments, and it can't consult the intentions of the builder. Doing any of those requires having a mind, and by general consensus, natural selection doesn't have one. All natural selection can do is respond to correlations between phenotypic traits and fitness, and that doesn't help because, by assumption, if either of the confounded traits is correlated with fitness, so too is the other. Footer's point was that whole organisms leave offspring, and they include numerous traits that are inevitably conflated. So when they leave offspring, it is impossible to say which of the conflated traits has been selected for. Footer's criticism has never been rebutted. Running wild. At one point, Darwin brought up an objection to his own theory. Naturalists claimed that domestic varieties, when set free and run wild, gradually but certainly revert in character to their aboriginal stocks. If so, no deductions can be drawn from domestic races to species in a state of nature. Here, in effect, Darwin himself was bringing up the extrapolation objection. But Darwin partly raised the issue himself. Many of the most strongly marked domestic varieties could not possibly live in a wild state, he allowed. Being conspicuous, they would be selected against. Reversion, as he called it, also implied that varieties don't stray far from a mean, or what Wallace called the original type. Unanswered, that criticism might revive the theory of archetypes as proposed by Darwin's contemporary and opponent, Richard Owen, who founded London's Natural History Museum. Darwin firmly rejected archetypes, the original pattern on which all things of the same kind are based, because they would set sharp limits to variation, and that would be fatal to his theory. That such limits to variation do exist was assumed by most authors, Darwin allowed, although he claimed not to know of a single fact on which their claim was based. But neither could he point to a single case of the unlimited variation that his theory required. All was based on his willingness to extrapolate from the small variations that we do routinely see between successive generations. In The Origin, Darwin gave one imaginary illustration of natural selection. He supposed a place where wolves are hard-pressed for food and prey is scarce. In that setting, he could see no reason to doubt that the swiftest and slimmest wolves would have the best chance of surviving and to be preserved or selected. But there is indeed a reason to doubt victory to the swiftest, as I shall argue in Chapter 5. In much the same way, he went on, man can improve the fleetness of his greyhounds by methodical selection. But the two cases are not remotely comparable. The selection of greyhounds by human breeders for speed is a purposive, goal-directed act, while the wolf case is not. In Chapter 6, I discuss the cases of natural selection that have actually been observed. Darwin also asked why, if species have descended from others by fine gradations, we don't see innumerable transitional forms. Furthermore, why are species so well defined? Why is all nature not in confusion? These were good questions. He tried to answer them by saying that the same process that improved and transformed some varieties extinguished their predecessors. Both the parent and all the transitional varieties will generally have been exterminated by the very process of formation and perfection of the new form. So once again, his understanding of natural selection as an all-powerful force came to his rescue. It could account both for the appearance and the disappearance of intermediate forms, whichever was needed. Meanwhile, the intermediate forms that his theory required have remained mostly elusive to this day. Darwin said at one point that if any complex organ could be shown to exist which could not have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, then his theory would absolutely break down. But he could find no such case. True, an organ so perfect as the eye was enough to stagger anyone. But for any organ, if we know of a long series of gradations in complexity, each good for its possessor, then under changing conditions of life, there is no logical impossibility in the acquirement of any conceivable degree of perfection through natural selection. Notice the weakness of his response. To say that perfection was not logically impossible for natural selection leaves unanswered the question, was it physically possible? In his book, Darwin's Black Box, Lehigh professor biochemist Michael Behe refuted Darwin's claim that complex organs could be formed by a long series of steps. See my Chapter 14 for more on Behe's objection. What about instinctive behavior? Such acts are performed by young animals without any experience and without knowing their purpose. Darwin mentioned the precise honeycomb structures of bees and the even more complex edifices built by ants. Instincts, he argued, were similar to habits. They can be modified by the will or reason. Mozart performed at the age of 3, but even he had to practice. Similarly, it would be an error to suppose that instincts were acquired in a single generation. As Darwin saw, a degree of variation in instincts was indispensable for natural selection to apply. Everything had to appear in the step-by-step fashion that his theory decreed. In fact, he wrote, the canon, natura non facit saltum, nature doesn't make jumps, is applicable to instincts as well as to corporeal structure. The problem for Darwin was that he knew of no cases of gradually acquired instincts. Instinctive behavior, therefore, really does seem to involve jumps without trial and error. Mozart indeed had to practice, but hive-making bees don't. Fossil record. Darwin candidly accepted that his theory predicted a finely graduated organic chain, which geology failed to show. It was the gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. Then he added a further complication. We should be looking for common ancestors, not intermediates between two forms. We don't expect to find intermediates between the horse and the tapir, for example. What we do expect are links between each and an unknown common parent. But that only magnified his problem. The number of intermediate and transitional links must have been inconceivably great. But assuredly, if this theory be true, such have lived upon this earth. Why then don't we see the intermediates that must have existed? Because new and improved varieties will inevitably supplant and exterminate the older, less improved and intermediate varieties. So, species are rendered to a large extent defined and distinct objects. Here, perhaps surprisingly, he brought in the phenomenon of extinction to rescue his theory. He argued that species need environmental slots if they are to flourish. The number of places in the polity of nature is not indefinitely great, he said. The extinction of old species, therefore, opened up new spaces for new ones. To strengthen his case, Darwin said that only a small portion of the Earth had been explored, so a poor fossil record was to be expected. Still, Darwin allowed, if we study a single formation, it is difficult to understand why we do not therein find closely graduated varieties between the allied species which lived at its commencement and at its close. More recent analyses of the fossil record have shown that it is more complete than most people realize. I discuss the issue in Chapter 10. When it came to classification, Darwin was a lumper, not a splitter. He concluded that there is no fundamental distinction between species and varieties. This worked greatly to his advantage, because mutation and natural selection can be shown to increase the number of varieties, but not to generate new species. To this day, such species transformations have not been demonstrated. They would be headline news if they had. He restated his faith in unlimited variation. The claim that it is limited was incapable of proof, he wrote. Since we see both variation and a powerful agent always ready to act and select, why should we doubt that more variation in any way useful would be preserved? He saw no limit to this power. Again, we find Darwin arguing not that his theory had been shown to be right, but that his opponents had failed to show that it was wrong. Darwin wrote that when The Origin was published, eminent naturalists had rejected his theory. Why so? Because they were convinced that species are immutable. Also, as Darwin saw it, we are slow to admit any great change when we do not see the intermediate steps. Yet to this day, species still do seem to be immutable, and the intermediate steps are still largely missing. In the following chapters, I shall look more closely at Darwin's various claims, in the light both of new evidence against them and of the failure of Darwinians to unearth much in support of them. But first, in the next chapter, I shall briefly review the copiously documented Darwin Centennial held in Chicago in 1959 with Darwin's grandson, Sir Charles, in attendance. Darwinism probably reached its greatest level of support at about that time.